Hi, I'm Dan Winter, and I'm excited to be part of the Magic of Hermes project, along with Roger and Paul and Bill. I'm very excited about the way in which the Hermes gold powder-like material is extracted and becomes part of the hydrosol. As Bill probably explained, there's an alkaline liquid which kind of takes the best part of the mineral-rich rock, and the critical thing is the alkalinity renders solubility. And there's a very rich, wonderful, kind of beautiful story behind Hermes, what it means, and how it came to be in hydrosol. Many of you know some of those stories. Remember when David Hudson originally extracted the gold powder, the white powder from gold. We think our ancestors were doing that, but recently in history, David Hudson did it. And as Paul was explaining earlier, it was so cool when he first got the stuff. You know, he knew it was powerful, but the chemists in the States couldn't figure it out. They thought it was silica. Is that right?
Yeah. Aluminum. Yeah.
Explain how that happened, and that he had to go to Russia to find out.
Yeah, basically in the spectroscopy tests that they were doing, the spectrographs were showing that it was silica and aluminum and a few other things, but very simple, and they were like dismissed it as nothing. But he knew he extracted this from pure gold, or changed the state of this pure gold into this white powder. So eventually he searched all around for a laboratory doing analysis, and spent, literally millions of dollars in the process of his discoveries, and finally found a laboratory in Russia that was able to. They said, "Oh yeah, we can analyze that stuff, and we know what it is." And so they were putting it on a carbon electrode, and then this carbon rod would burn for like a 3-minute burn. And as it burned, the spectrogram would go through different elements, mostly in the platinum metal group, and all of a sudden it would pop out of the silica and show up as gold, and then platinum, iridium, rhodium, and go through the spectrum.
So the rich,
during that burn, which is in a plasma state.
Yeah.
Right?
And the rich part is that the perfect collapse there is what allows it to transition. So you know, as Paul's lifetime is, and Bill is doing isotope transition physics here, but the magic is non-destructive collapse, implosive collapse, centripetal collapse, negentropic collapse. And whether it's hydrogen or whether it's gold, it appears the symmetry is what we call conjugate. And the metaphor to visualize we've always used, which is very appropriate, is the sort of two pine cones kissing noses. We have this picture here. You see the two pine cones kissing noses sort of affair, and it gets into the whole Grail thing. But what it is that originally conjugation was discovered when two lasers approaching from opposite directions would produce negentropic self-organization in optics. And this would time reversal, all kinds of cool things. It's basically an electric field which becomes suction towards center electrically, as to say implosive, negentropic, conjugate, self-organizing, all these terms are used. And what does this have to do with gold powder, and what does this have to do with Hermes? Well, the valence symmetry of gold, this is the whole nobility issue. What makes it gold is obviously that the outer electron shells are all complete, as to say noble, chemically untouchable. And what that means in this case is the SPDF subshell array is so complete there's no need to add or take away electrons. But if you look at what the symmetry of those outer arrays are in the case of gold and the conjugate materials, they're all dodecaecosa, our star mother, stellated dodeca story, the pent symmetries, as in clathrates in water, as in fullerene. They all produce this magic space in the center, implosive, negentropic, centripetal. So, we could go on and on about the physics of gold powder. It's very, very relevant to even our ancestors because, many people believe, I think correctly, the original Holy Communion was a white gold powder, and it was served in a pine cone wafer. You can even see the carvings at Rennes-le-Château. The principal food was served in a little pine cone there, and it was the white gold powder, the manna, the Hermes, the spice. The physics, and this is the fun part, the physics appears to be that blood and saliva, for example, benefit in terms of becoming negentropic and self-organizing. You see, phase conjugation occurs at different spectra. And the gold atom induces phase conjugation at the atomic level. It can be done optically, it can be done magnetically, it can be done dielectrically. But in every case, it's the same symmetry. It's these two pine cones that implode, kiss noses. So when you get it in your blood or saliva, it induces a quality that induces, for example, in DNA, we believe, recursive braiding, implosive ensoulment, that whole conversation. So we could go on and on. There's a whole section on our website, goldenmean.info/gold powder. There's dozens of articles. But applying this to the Hydrosol, maybe Bill would like to talk about how the Hydrosol gets the gold powder or the Hermes-like effect out of the rock and what that means chemically.
No, it's just the it's a sodium hydroxide reduction.
Mm-hmm. And you often talk about the fact that the really special rock that has these very rich trace mineral gold powder-like material, and when the rocks are done with the alkaline, it's like they're spent, right?
Yeah, a lot of earth rock really, I mean, from granite on up has the Hermes in there. Mm-hmm. It's just a matter of extracting that.
Which is to say, you know, the Barry Carter work with agricultural Hermes where they extract it from deep seawater. Again, they're using an alkaline material. Again, it's this milky white. It's a fabulous... What it is it's
magnesium hydroxide, which forms the cages that the monatomic or high spin state elements are fitting into. Mm-hmm. Is their molecular cages.
Yes, exactly. And the best cage here is the dodecaecosa. You've seen our Star Mother kit. And this is the clathrate cage and the fullerene. The fullerene became the hottest subject in modern chemistry because of that magic space in the center where you could do anything. Or even with Pat Flanagan's microhydrin. It was because he tucked it inside the clathrate for water. So, now that you have that solubility for the best part of the mineral, putting it in the Hydrosol as a central component of many of the Magic of Hermes products means that solubility becomes available in your body. So for myself personally, when I take, for example, the mouthwash, I find, you know, it's actually like eating a little gold powder, actually. I mean, it's you get that buzz, really, from it. Right. And you can feel the solubility. You can feel the tendency towards centripetal charge density. And in my experience, I even experience it as having a bit of antiseptic and also reduction of swelling. Right. And you can see why it would reduce swelling,
absolutely.
Reduce inflammation, because it's electrically centripetal.
Right. Yeah, and it's increasing that cellular communication and lowering the surface tension that's around the membranes of the various components of the cells and increasing the cellular communication,
Yeah, and the cell itself acts as a capacitor, as an electrolytic capacitor, with nucleus being one electrode, the membrane being the outer electrode, and the dielectric being the cytoplasm itself.
Inside, right.
And if the cytoplasm is low in those electrolytes, then I think that the life potential of a cell is directly related to that.
Absolutely.
This would be a good occasion for a little public relations, since Bill is mentioning dielectric, for our whole curriculum about living architecture and living clothing, fractal clothing and fractal architecture. See, Bill mentioned the word dielectric, which refers to essentially the quality of the insulator between the plates of a capacitor, such that if you ring it like a bell, which is the voltage, which is pressure, the quality with which that bell rings back, in other words, how much energy comes back when you ring it. If the dielectric is high enough, the bell rings back with more energy than you hit it with. Well, why do you need to know the dielectric quality of your cells and your clothing and your house? It is because your life force is the ability of your plasma bubble, your Ka, to propagate. And if that cannot get centripetal and breathe electrically, the inertia there is lost. And that means whether you're a Catholic, I mean whether you have a Ka or Merkaba, is the amount of coherence of that aura. So that inertia needs to be fed. In order to feed that inertia, the capacitance of your aura has to breathe charge. So whether it's the cell getting a dielectric quality from the Hermes, or whether it's your clothing being made of hemp and trace mineral baked in the sunlight like Callahan proved, so your aura actually gains charge. And then your house, made of biologic living materials, also the capacitance can be centripetal and charge can breathe and grow. So the philosophy behind the Magic of Hermes is actually a complete philosophy about the life force in general, which is called Hermes for a very good reason. Maybe we close with this. It's just that, you know the symbol of Hermes, the caduceus, in physics that's called phase conjugation, which means that life force itself is always the ability to get centripetal. As we say, get centripetal or get dead. And when we say this reduces swelling, etc., and attracts charge, it's because it's negentropic, and there's for centripetal, which is the whole philosophy also of implosion. So anything else we should say about Hermes and Hydrosol?
Maybe, Bill, you could explain a bit about the collapsing of the atoms and the deforming of the nuclei in this so-called high-spin state, the theory of how the actual atom structure is.
The isotope collapse.
Yeah, the atoms actually have two different phase states, so that there's one phase state which is in phase with our physical reality, and another phase state which is probably 90 degrees out of physical reality. And that's the one that we're calling virtual matter or exotic matter.
Exotic matter, right.
And with that one, it doesn't interact directly with physical reality, although it does distort space-time, and that would be equivalent to what they're calling dark matter as well. So this might be what they're calling orgone energy. For example, in the orgone accumulators, Reich noticed that in large concentrations there was this white precipitate that would form inside the accumulator.
Right.
Not only that, but there was also in deserts a white powder forming in some of the rocks.
Mana in the desert.
Yeah.
Mana in the desert. So you'd scrape it off the rocks and they'd analyze it and they'd, oh, it's just silica. Well, it's not just silica. I mean, this was actually the Hermes precipitate coming from the atmosphere.
Right.
So,
And if the atmosphere is charged or the rocks is
And
charged,
if the rocks had any of the metallic elements in them, they were also precipitating on the outside of the rock,
Right.
migrating and changing. Yeah.
right.
you can see why it was called the spice in Dune, you know.
Yeah.
And it relates to all the mythologies about the origin of Holy Communion and Hermes and Mana in the desert. It's
Yeah. The other interesting thing is that Reich also mentioned that the orgone energy had radiation had a deleterious effect on it. I mean, it would produce DOR, deadly orgone.
Yeah.
Well, we also know that with Hermes and radiation does not get along. For example, with Hudson, you would put it out in sunlight and the ultraviolet light would cause it to disappear when it's just this flash. Gamma rays do the same thing.
Right.
So we have a direct correlation now between this material and orgone energy. So it could just be a different phase state of Hermes.
when you think of phase state, one way to imagine that possibly is when the wave is in its compression phase. It's simply a wave. In one phase it's compressing and the other is rarefying. And so when the wave is rarefying, that part of the wave is not visible to us. You know, it's out of phase exactly. But the key issue is that when the force is centripetal, and as we say negentropic, it's able to precipitate. Very practically, there were many stories, even in the Carolinas when I was there, that in a proper cave, if you had the right charge, you would see a white gold powder form on the gold. Actually, little white. You talked about that as well earlier.
Yeah.
And so the ability to precipitate that requires a negentropic environment. Also, I would like to comment about the orgone that one aspect, I know there's more to it, and Bill has said, but one aspect of the orgone is what we're calling a phase conjugate dielectric, as in that famous paper, Alice in Barium Titanate Land. And the phase conjugate dielectric is, you could think of it as an implosive capacitor. Maybe this is oversimplification, but the point being that the story was, for example, the Ark of the Covenant, which was how you made your gold powder if you happen to be needing big money and you happen to be the Jews. And that's how they made the gold powder. That's what Lawrence Gardner detailed.
Well, not only that, but I mean, this stuff is a phenomenal dielectric constant.
There you go.
So, I mean, if you're going to make a big capacitor, what do you load it with? Is something with a really, really high dielectric constant.
And you look at an orgone accumulator, what is it but just a capacitor itself? It's got a metallic and an organic layer, and it's layered, a multi-stack capacitor, essentially in folding in on itself, because it's a conjugated cube that's imploding onto the
It's
center.
fractal, yes.
And what's happening there is the reason why you're having a temperature differential between the inside of the chamber and the outside.
Colder, yes. So it's cooling and therefore adding order. And if we look at the traditional description of the Ark of the Covenant, the alternate layers of acacia wood and gold, precisely how to build a negentropic or phase conjugate capacitor. The final thing I wanted to say about that was many who have really studied this conclude that indeed one of its functions, aside from earning lots of money by enabling the manufacture of the white gold powder, was the Ark of the Covenant was how you safely stored your nukes. Very important information, because we know that the right positive, some call them microvita. What did Cedric call them? That the right biologic material, microzyme, thank you, that the right biologic materials also reduce radioactivity measurably.
Right.
And in fact, it is believed, there are reports that Uri Geller did a major study where he showed focused human attention, which we know Tiller proved was electrically centripetal, reduces radioactivity.
Increased decay rates. Yeah.
Right. So if we understood this lesson, which is radioactivity is obviously centrifugal electrically, a phase conjugate dielectric, the Ark of the Covenant,
Right.
that is negentropic, it's
Hold
implosive.
it back in itself.
That's right. So the Ark of the Covenant was a safe way to contain your nukes. So then it gives you a whole new way to read the Bible, because the hygiene they described to hold this electrical device.
Right.
So, it's all about learning the science, and then it changes from mythology, which is not unhelpful, but it becomes self-empowering when it becomes science.
Excellent.
So, we had some fun. Thank you, Roger.
Mm-hmm.